This is our final Timothy series of the year, and we have been blessed to have Pastor Colin Smith from the Orchard and EFCA Church in Arlington Heights with us. How this works is usually I'll open with a few questions for Pastor Smith, and then we'll ask you what questions you might have for him. If you have a question, simply raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. And at that point, if you would stand for your questions, because we are taping this session. Pastor Colin, thank you for being here. It's wonderful to have you. And I was wondering if you could begin our time by speaking a little bit about God's call upon your life and ministry. And what forms did that take?
Well, first, thanks for coming to this time. It's an absolute delight to have the opportunity of interacting in this way, and Q&A is a great privilege. I remember sensing a call to ministry from quite early in life. I spoke to my pastor when I was 12 years old and said that I felt that I was being drawn to be a pastor and so forth. I was brought up in a Christian home. I don't remember wanting to do anything else, and so that desire was in my heart from very early on. Pastor was very wise. He said the classic sort of Spurgeon thing, well, don't just do this because you feel drawn to it. You need to wait and see if others confirm this, and so forth and so on. And that really was the path, and I still think it's the case that there's both an internal and an external dimension to any call to ministry. There is a sense of drawing, and then there's a piece that what do other people see? I just read actually a very, very helpful little book that's just come out in the last few months. Dave Harvey, Am I Called? Am I Called? It's published by Crossway. I just read it a couple of weeks ago. And he just goes through some of the qualifications for leadership. He starts with, am I godly? That's the first question. I thought, that's brilliant. That's that's what we were talking about this morning. It's exactly the place to start. Not that we're going to sit here and say, well, Scott, the answer is yes. But is there a passionate pursuit of God that is burning within my own heart? That's the baseline. Then, how is my family is the next question. And then on into questions, can I preach? Can I shepherd God's people? And so forth. And then he asked the question, what do other people say? And that's really the key question. So it started with me with a desire, and then doing some things. You don't know what God's gifted you to do until you've tried it. There's only one way to discover what giftings there are, and that is to do things, and then to listen to what people are saying, and to try to be teachable, and to try and keep that.
Yeah. As you wrestled with God's call, how has the process of discovering your gifts gone? What does that look like for you?
Well, I think I go back to just the comment that by doing things, and then looking to other people for their reflections on that, because often what we think we do and what other people think is useful are two very different things.
Right.
And preachers perhaps find that more than anyone else. All of you who preach know what it is to come out of a pulpit and think, oh dear, that was terrible. It was terrible. And you rarely come out of a pulpit thinking, man alive, I hit a home run today. I don't experience that. So your own reflections are one thing.
Yes.
The reflections of others are very important. So.
And what would you identify as some of the skills for ministry that you've discovered in yourself?
Yeah.
Obviously, preaching is probably significant, but that and what else?
Well, I think of pastoral ministry in terms of three dimensions. It is to preach, it is to pastor, and it is to lead. And see, one of the things in the culture from which I come is that you don't have specialized ministries. There's not a job in most churches for a youth pastor or a music pastor or whatever else. There's a job to be a pastor, and there's a job to be an assistant pastor who one day is going to become a pastor. And so the church culture in which I was raised really had these three things very clearly intertwined, that to be in pastoral ministry means you're going to preach, you're going to pastor, and you're going to lead. Now, I know that this setting is very, very different, but I would encourage guys to think about that model. It is very, very difficult to sustain spiritual life in ministry apart from some teaching element. You may not be the pulpit guy, but I would want to encourage anyone in ministry to have some kind of teaching of the word that is penetrated into whatever it is you're doing and whatever it is that the church asks you to do. The pastoral piece, which is simply engaging with the real needs of real people, is huge. To be a shepherd of the sheep and not simply a kind of voice teaching the sheep. And then clearly leadership, which involves a lot of the direction of the church and influence and so forth. So, the prophet, priest, king, I think has some application in relation to the dimensions of ministry and also to being like Christ, who is the prophet, priest, king. So,
Before we field some questions, would you talk a little bit about your current context in Arlington Heights and maybe some of the unique opportunities and challenges that you find in the suburban church?
I love the church that I'm privileged to serve. Psalm 16, the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. I have to say that about my whole life. The privilege of serving a wonderful church that I still love. I had the joy of going back there. They've just gone into a new building, and I got to preach there last month. When I left there, my assistant, who'd been with me for 3 years, became the pastor. He's still there, and the church is doing so well. So that was a great joy, and I love the church that I've been privileged to, that I'm privileged to serve now. The greatest challenges never lie in other people. The greatest challenges lie here. And that was what this morning's message was about. So I wouldn't want anything to take away from that. The responsibility to be a steward of your own spiritual life, that is the struggle, I think, in Christian ministry, whatever the context. And we can talk a little bit about different contexts, but it's a relative. That's of a different order from the thing that's primary. If God put me into any context, if God puts you into any context, you will face the same challenge, which is going to be the quality of your own spiritual life, your own faith, your own zeal, the maintenance of these things, the replenishing of these things, your own freshness in the Word, and so forth and so on. Context makes very, very little difference to that. But of course it gets a lot more attention because that's what people write about and what attention gets focused on. So, there's no one here who doesn't need, who needs me to talk about some of the challenges of ministering in suburbia. You guys all know that. I mean, you don't need me to talk about how that's different from other contexts. But what I want to say is it's not the primary thing.
Yeah, appreciate that. What questions do you have for Pastor Smith?
Do you mind just describing the orchard a little bit more, maybe, for us who don't know? And just maybe some of the different leadership, just challenges that your church maybe is facing even currently right now?
Sure, be glad to do that. Guys, glad to take all questions. If you'd give me your name when you ask a question, that would really help me. And so, Brian, thank you, appreciate it. So the Orchard is now a multi-site church. There are 3 campuses, one in Arlington Heights that has been there for 60 years, one in Barrington and one in Itasca, and the latter 2 have been there just over 1 year now. We took the initiative to recruit about 500 people from our congregation to launch the work at Barrington. And about 100 who went with one of our pastors to launch what's going on at Itasca. The first of these was planned in the sense that we'd come to the conclusion that rather than build larger in the same location, which was obviously not a path that was opening to us, that we would seek to see ministry grow by opening up work in a new location, but without it being severed in the way that a church plant is typically separated from a new church. When we were in the middle of that, we purchased a property, we recruited people to do that. When we were in the middle of that, we had a small evangelical free church in Itasca. 20 people, godly, praying people, but just 20. And their finances were coming towards an end. They had a little bit of money left. They had a pastor, and they were facing closure. And they said to us, if we give you this building, would you receive us as members? We got enough money for most of a salary for a year. Would you take our pastor for a year to give him a bridge, as it were, to find something else? And would you reopen this church as part of the Orchard? And it was not our timing, because we were right in the middle of this other thing. But we felt that the Lord was in it. That was the discernment of our leaders. And one of our pastoral staff felt a drawing to go do this. And he had the ability to draw about 100 people who went down there with him, almost all of whom have come back. And they said at the beginning, hey, we'll come down, we'll help you for a year, but we're coming back. And that's what they said, and that's what they've done. What has been marvelous is to see that they have all now been replaced, and there's about 150 people there, and they're almost entirely a local congregation to that area, which is remarkable. So work has been restarted. One of the advantages and one of the great joys of my life is to have a preaching team. And when I don't preach, multiple guys, a couple of whom are in this room, get the opportunity to do that, and that to me is a great joy. But that's some of the dynamics of I'm glad to chat about multi-site and all of that, but that's what we have. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. My name is my name is Patrick.
Patrick.
And the question I have is, as you've developed as a leader, and you're talking a lot about leadership, have you also wrestled with sort of the uniqueness of leaders, like the personality of that you bring into your leadership is very different from maybe one of your campus pastors. And so how have you allowed sort of the foundational principles to sort of build up sort of the uniqueness, so you're not just sort of cookie-cuttering pastors or cookie-cuttering people to be like, hey, I want you to just be me.
Yeah, wouldn't it be funny if everyone at the Orchard spoke with a Scottish accent? Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm going to revert back to what we were talking about in the chapel this morning, because the things that affect spiritual life for all leaders and for all churches actually have huge commonality. Am I praying with faith? Am I leading with zeal? And so forth and so on. Multiple leaders on a team with diversity of gifts, diversity of accents, diversity of styles. But there isn't anyone on our pastoral team doesn't face these same kinds of challenges. So there has to be a culture that allows expression of individuality. That's part of the wonderful diversity that God gives to us. To me, one of the most exciting ministries in the Orchard is the multicultural ministry at the moment. Shohei Suzuki, who was sitting where you guys now are just a few years ago, became an intern and has just taken a whole new level of ministry, which is one of the great, great gifts of God in the life of the church. And so you look at different members of our pastoral staff, they are very, very different people. But if you take Shohei and myself, we're just obviously very, very different styles of people and from a totally different cultural background. Almost nothing in common at that level. His challenges in ministry are exactly the same as the one that I'm facing in terms of what we're talking about this morning. So I don't want to just keep coming back to one point, but diversity is just a fantastic gift. And with it, let's not forget that there's a commonality that goes to the very core of every Christian's life, you know.
My name's Tim. You talked about leadership will fail in there's three ways, and that if you're headed in the wrong direction, that's an obvious one. I wondered if you could expand on what you think are some of those wrong directions, and maybe what the right one is. I mean, obviously we all kind of know to a degree, but if you could talk about some common mistakes.
And let's make this a conversation, but I'll throw out a couple of very obvious wrong directions. The church's ministry becomes about a personality. The church's ministry or vision becomes about a new building. The church's ministry gets more and more focused on fundraising, and so, I mean, you can, it's not difficult to pull these things together because they're easily identified and they're easily seen. So, one of the great challenges of life, and it flows out of one's own walk with the Lord that we've been talking about, is keeping the gospel at the center of the life of the church, so that it is true and evident to people that the gospel really is the thing that we're all about, and not any particular ministry or other things that I've referred to. That is always a challenge. There will always be people who will come into the church, whatever you're setting, whatever you're leading, whatever ministry you're in charge of, there will always be people coming into the church and they have a thing, and they want to make your church about their thing. And you face that pressure all the time, and what it is will change. Sometimes it's a theological emphasis. We want to make the church about Israel, or something like that. There are multiple examples. But this is where I appreciate what Don and Tim Keller are doing so much in the Gospel Coalition, and so grateful for the close ties between Trinity and the Coalition, and the privilege of being involved in it myself. The issue of keeping the gospel at the center of the church is a lifelong challenge, and it will be for you guys as well. And churches that have the gospel at the center for sure will look different in different settings and so forth, and yet there's going to be a recognizable heartbeat that is familiar across the settings. And one of the wonderful things, of course, is traveling internationally and just feeling completely at home where the gospel's at the center in a completely different culture. I mean, for me, being in India and being in the middle of gospel celebration in a totally alien culture and feeling completely at home, because the thing that's at the center is absolutely the thing that I'm trying to build my life around and want the church to be around. That's fantastic. And you know it, and you taste it. But you can also sense ways in which churches get away from that, and that will be true in the Orchard as much as any other church, because you're constantly fighting this battle, and none of us does it perfectly. None of us does it perfectly, I don't know if I'm answering the questions or not, but I'm giving it my best shot.
It's great. It's great.
Hi there, my name's Todd, and another thing you hinted at when you were speaking in chapel was, of course, the importance of constantly moving forward in your spiritual life, and the leader needs to always be, moving themselves. But, given that a large number of people in the ministry cope with depression as a lifelong battle, what advice would you give to people in the ministry who are dealing with depression as they're still trying to find means of advancing themselves even in times of spiritual silence?
That's good, thank you. That's a wonderful question and a perceptive question. And there are multiple layers of the answer, because there are very, very different kinds of spiritual depression. There is a kind of depression for which a person should seek medical help and may benefit lifelong from medical help, because it has at its core a chemical issue, and I would want to encourage anyone who's dealing with that to take that route. There are multiple forms of depression that might be better put under the banner of discouragement, but depression's an appropriate word. This is where Lloyd Jones' book, Spiritual Depression, is so helpful. I've read that so many times. What Lloyd Jones did, this is a series of sermons that he preached, I don't know, would it have been the 1950s, I think? Probably the 1950s. And each sermon analyzes a different cause of spiritual depression. And what is so interesting is that Lloyd Jones was a medical doctor before he became a preacher. So he comes from this whole world of diagnosis and great understanding of these things. And took the ability that he had as a doctor in terms of medical diagnosis and then prescription and applied it to his whole preaching. His sermons invariably are in two parts, diagnosis, prescription. So every sermon, I think there are 23 in the series, diagnoses a specifically a different root cause of spiritual depression. And so, for example, I just walked with a guy in England trying to he from our church. He's now married. He's in England, and he hit a real spiritual depression, a real spiritual crisis. So I said to him, "Read Lloyd Jones, the whole book, and I want you to tell me what are the 3 chapters that most speak to you, and then we'll have extended conversations about 2 or 3 of these over the telephone, and we'll walk through." Because I need to have some understanding what's the cause of your spiritual depression. He identified 3. We did that. In God's mercy, he is saying that he is in a different place in his life. The first one that he identified was, Lloyd Jones talks about that where Jesus touches the guy and he says, "I see men like trees walking. I see something. I don't see it clearly." And what was at the root of this guy's, this is just an experience in the last month, at the root of this guy was, he said, he was brought up in my church. So he's been under my ministry. He said, Colin, he said, it's dawned on me, for all the years I've been a Christian, I have never understood justification by faith. He said that to me 3 weeks ago over the phone. I have never understood justification by faith. I'm still trying to prove myself to God. And he'd gone into a missions organization that had given a lot of intensity, a bit of perfectionism, and it was crushing him. That was why he'd come to a spiritual crisis. And, that was just one diagnosis. Lloyd Jones has about 22 others. So it's impossible to talk adequately about that. You're asking a hugely important question. I quoted from Weary in Well-Doing, that really spoke to my soul as recently as 2 weeks ago. And I was so convicted by his statement that if you are just saying, I have to do this thing, you are spitting in the face of Christ. I read that in Good Friday. I cannot spit in the face of Jesus Christ on Good Friday. And that was a discouragement that I was battling for various reasons. And will battle again. So God is wonderful. He knows how to meet us where we are, and every Christian will be in dark places many times, and you cannot be a Christian leader you've got to expect to be in a dark place lots of times, and then to remember that God has the grace and he has the ability to pull you out of it. And some of us by temperament will be there more than others, but none of us will be without being there. So God bless you. God bless you.
My name is Chipper.
Sorry,
that's okay. I had a question going back to your personality being one of the wrong directions.
Yeah.
How do you do something like the Gospel Coalition, which, I benefit a lot from. I love to hear guys on there, and I know you have a multi-sect church, and there's a lot of benefit from that. How do you do those well without making it about the personalities? What are some of the discussions that go on to kind of mitigate against that?
You cannot eliminate personality. Philip Brooks' famous definition of preaching is truth through personality. God speaks through people. God is able to do exceeding abundant above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. So God works through people. you will have ministry because God works through people. So it was very interesting at T4G. There was a session that was about what they called celebrity pastors and this critique of celebrity pastors. And Carl Trueman was there. He's been interacting with Tiberi Anabwili, and the two of them sat side by side. I think it was quite a profitable kind of discussion. And Tiberi had made the point, there's also such a thing as give honor to whom honor is due, and that's in the Bible as well, and so forth and so on. And so I'm aware of the debate, particularly in folks who are known nationally and so forth and so on. In large measure, a lot of this has to be about the spirit of the heart of a man. Is a man humble in heart? And ultimately, God alone knows the full range of what goes on in the heart, and all of us have mixed stuff within the heart, every one of us. It's easy. I've never been on a platform at a place like T4G. I don't ever expect I would be. But it's easy to have as much pride wishing that you were. And I sense there's a great danger on the critique side that can come out of an equal level of pride, wannabes, that can be every bit as much of a danger as the person who might become infatuated with their own ministry. So I have to watch the greatest danger of my own heart, and all of us have to watch the greatest danger of our own hearts. And that may be different over time. And I don't know how you guys find it. Different world. I don't dip into the blog world half as much as folks who are a generation younger than I am do. But when I have dipped in, I thought, oh boy. Don't you find yourselves grieved sometimes, guys, and ladies, by some of the acid that seems to be out there? And, when John Piper took his sabbatical, I thank God for John Piper. And here clearly is a man who is bearing huge burdens in his own soul, weights that I can't begin to imagine in terms of, you have a range of ministry, and here's a guy who's been given a platform of ministry that's so much wider. And you get people knocking and spearing and almost spitting on the blogs. Oh, suppose you told your elders that this was preordained before the foundation of the world, that you'd have 6 months sabbatical. And I think, what is that? How can you be a Christian and have that kind of bile against someone who God has anointed in the life of the church? So anyone who's given a broad platform is going to have to watch their own heart. And God will give some of you a broader platform than other people you look at right now. And you'll have to watch your own heart. And then all of us who are given a lesser platform have to watch our own hearts too, because we're looking at other guys who are given bigger platforms, and got to watch your own heart.
Yeah.
So that's what I think about that.
Yeah.
A few questions ago, it was asked if you could elaborate on the pitfall of constantly moving forward, not constantly moving forward in leadership. Could you do the same with isolation? My name's Ian, by the way.
Ian, thank you. In relation to isolation from the people.
And when does, exactly.
Yeah.
And when does that, or if it does at all, cross with our own Western individualism?
Yes, right. Oh, that's very interesting.
Not to paint broad brushstrokes.
Thank you, Ian. Just to rejoice in the point that arises from the nature of Christ out of that he never loses one of those who are entrusted to him, and he is the great shepherd. But this Christ being, he is never isolated from his people. So The great danger here in leadership is that I or any other leader is in a small circle of people who are fired up about the vision and fired up about this and fired up about that, and somehow end up being detached from where other people are. And I think it's not rocket science. I mean, the only thing that I can say to that is the importance of the discipline of listening and of finding different contexts in which to listen. Our lay leaders, we got a board meeting tonight. We'll talk about the spiritual life of the church as part of that, some of the things that I talked today about because we're following on from Sunday. We'll talk about that in small group gatherings where we're meeting for prayer over these next weeks. Last Sunday night, Karen and I hosted the second of 3 evenings that we're having in our home for all of the longest standing members of the church. We found our last charter member went to be with the Lord at the turn of the year. So I thought, our last charter member just went to be with the Lord. So who's our longest serving member? So I asked them to give me that list, and when it was printed off, we found we had 120 people who are still in membership of the church who've been in membership for more than 30 years. And we have 40 who've been in membership more than 40 years. So the Bible says, give honor to whom honor is due. So we thought we've got to do something to honor the people who've just given so much of their lives and been faithful servants, and they're still here. So we're having 3 evenings by chronology, and it's a kind of walk down memory lane and the heritage of the church, and just listening. And not talking about anything to do with the future, and not talking about anything that's happened in the last 16 years, or Pastor Greg Waybright's time, which was the 7 years before I've been privileged to be there, but just going back to when you became a member of the church. And Pastor Ted Olson, who many of you will know, has shared that with me. So the two of us sit in chairs. We had 40 people, and packed in, and just listening. So to find... I'm just giving a specific example because that's what I'm doing right now. But you always have to be finding different ways to listen to the people and to hear the heart of the people and to try to keep connected. And pastoral work is a huge part of that, because you touch the deepest places of people's lives where you're privileged to do that.
Pastor Colin, your great second question here, am I serving with zeal? When you come up with a negative answer to that, I guess one alternative is to try to relight the fire. Yeah. Can you think of a time when another possible solution might be to trim some things off so that you've got a little less to do that you can feel excited about?
Right, yeah.
Have you been in situations where you were able to, because you do a lot, have you been able to trim things, or known of times when you wish you could have trimmed things off?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. Are there more things that need to be trimmed? Probably. Does getting tired relate to diminishing zeal? Absolutely. I mean, we're working with a physical body here and a physical brain. One of the things I found most helpful some years ago, Greg, on this, Brian Larson has written a book. I forget the title. It's about perseverance. Craig Brian Larson. And he has just a little bit in there where he says, most of us in ministry, and he's a bivocational pastor, so how he does all he does, I don't know. But most of us in ministry overestimate what it takes for us to recover. And what he says is, you get to a place in ministry where you think, I need a year off, And actually, 3 weeks would do it. I've been amazed where I felt I need a month off, how often 3 nights. Just Karen and I said, let's just go for a couple of nights. And how replenishing and how helpful that has proved to be. Now, it felt like it was 5, and it did me more good than I thought. So we're always going to be in cycles. Who is it that said, the world is run by tired men? The world is run by tired men. So you know, I don't want to be other than that. What's the alternative? I'm living within my comfort zone. You know, a couple of years into ministry, I became a pastor when I was 22. In God's kindness, the education system here prevents you from doing that and runs up too many debts at the same time. But that's another story. But I studied at London Bible College, studied theology for 3 years, straight into no gen ed, just did study theology. Became a pastor at 22, 3 weeks after I was married. Ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. So you're preserved from that. So you just get thrown in the deep end. And I was completely and utterly exhausted, and you know, I felt like I had given everything I was ever going to have to give after 2 years. Yeah. And there's a magazine that's still published now. It now comes under the Gospel Coalition, called Themelios. Are you familiar with Themelios? And Themelios came through the door, literally, was posted through the door. I worked from home. One day when I felt desperately, desperately low, and how am I going to continue? And this thing came through, and I opened it up. I mean, this is how God kindly knows where you're in need. I opened it up. There was an article, this would be 1982 Themelios, as I recall it, Richard Bauckham, and it was called Paul's Weakness and Ours. You still check it out. It's a wonderful article. 1980s Themelios. That'll get it for you. Paul's weakness and ours. It's on 2 Corinthians in chapter 12, where Paul says, you know, is who's weak and I do not feel weak, and when I'm weak and then I'm strong. And in that, I can't quote it from memory, but the gist of it is this. Bauckham says this: we do not follow the idealized image of the secular Superman who has his whole life organized in compartments so that he lives within his comfort zone, and it's this and it's this, and you know, this kind of idea that you could pull your organizer together and be in command of your life and all would be well, you know. He said, that is not our model. We follow one who goes to a cross and then says, come and follow me, and pushes himself. So which do I want to be? And that was so helpful for me, because the idea of trying to, if you set out looking for a ministry that's going to be within a comfort zone, where's it going to end? So one has to watch one's health, one has to listen to one's wife, one has to listen to wise lay leaders, and one has to expect always to be a tired man, and that the world is led by tired men, and always to be pushing the boundaries, because I've only got one life. And I'm going to sound like I quoted Piper earlier. Don't waste your life. Who said that? It's a great title. I want to waste my life.
It's good. We are at the top of the hour. I sense there probably are more questions. So thankfully, we have an opportunity here from Colin Smith on Thursday as well. I encourage you to come back to chapel Thursday. He'll be speaking again. If you're free tomorrow, he'll actually be speaking in our college chapel as well. We're grateful to have you all week. And hey, thank you for this time. I appreciate it.